Hi, and welcome to the Deep Dive. This is where we really get into the source material that shapes things, try and pull out the knowledge you need to be, well, truly informed. Today, we are really strapping in. This might be the most comprehensive, intense spiritual journey maybe ever documented in Western esotericism. We're doing a deep dive into 177 absolutely grueling days a modern practitioner spent trying to make contact, like real, objective, divine contact with his ultimate guide.
That's right. And it's a remarkable account we're looking at. Frankly, pretty terrifying, too. Our source material today is pulled from these really detailed, very candid journals and later reflections of Marcus Katz. He used the magical name Frieder FP for this. And we're going to detail his entire 6-month commitment, this massive undertaking, to achieve what's called the knowledge and conversation of the Holy Guardian Angel, the KNC of the HGA. It's a quest that, well, it demands absolutely everything.
Okay, let's unpack this a bit then. The KNC of the HGA, it sounds like the ultimate goal,
right?
The kind of end game for ceremonial magic. Before we jump into the schedule, the demanding parts, what is the prize here? What does getting this KNC actually mean? Not just magically, but, spiritually, psychologically.
Right. It's definitely more than just a prize. It's framed as a complete overhaul of the self, a total transformation. According to these traditions, achieving the KNC of the HGA, it's seen as the single primary goal, the main objective for any serious ceremonial magician. And critically, it's considered the prerequisite. You need this before you can achieve any subsequent spiritual mastery or magical ability. It's the gateway to, well, complete spiritual liberation, ultimately. If you look at the structure of pretty much all Western esoteric systems, Golden Dawn, Thelema, they're all kind of pathways leading up to this moment of recognition, this contact.
Okay, so it's like the ultimate initiation then. You can't really progress in high magic until this fusion, this meeting happens.
Exactly. That's the idea. The Holy Guardian Angel itself, it's described using these really powerful, intimate metaphors, very suggestive language. It gets called the secret lover, for instance. It's seen as the magician's ultimate mentor, their teacher, their guide through all the higher levels of initiation. It's meant to be this moment of ecstatic union. Undeniable. A conscious meeting that's supposed to be more transformative, more life-altering than any other human experience you could possibly imagine. It's presented as objective contact with the divine spark of your own self, with a capital S.
And connecting that to the bigger picture, there seems to be this core idea about human nature wrapped up in it. You mentioned metaphors of completion.
Yes, exactly. The sort of foundational metaphor here suggests that we, as ordinary people, driven by ego, were fundamentally unfinished, incomplete in some really profound way. Think of the classic fairy tale idea, right? The slumbering princess, trapped, waiting. The KNC is that moment of awakening, that union with the questing prince who represents the angel. And sometimes, interestingly, the angel is also seen as kind of unfinished until it unites with the manifested human consciousness. So the end result, the goal, is that the practitioner and the angel together, they become somebody else. A totally new, integrated identity emerges from that union. And the engine, the thing that drives this whole incredibly difficult 6-month process, the key to unlocking it all, it's defined simply as love.
Wow. A total identity shift. But the source material and the history behind it is really clear, isn't it? This whole thing is incredibly risky. What are the actual stakes for trying the Abramelin Operation? Especially given that our practitioner, Marcus Katz, he already had a pretty high magical grade, right?
That's a really crucial point, yeah. He was already an Adeptus Minor. Now, in systems like the Golden Dawn, that grade signifies, a certain mastery, control over elemental forces, deep understanding of practical magic. But even with that level of experience, the Abramelin Operation is seen as the ultimate test, and it requires surrender, not control. That's key. The ritual itself is sometimes called the one perfect ritual in magic. It takes precedence over everything else. But Abraham of Worms, the original author, he was brutally honest about the chances of success. He actually wrote, and I think this is worth quoting, "I swear by the true God that out of 100 persons who might undertake this operation, there would be only 2 or 3 who would actually attain to it."
Wait, 2 or 3 out of 100? That's a 97% failure rate. That's astronomical. So you're risking 6 months of your life, your sanity maybe, your finances possibly, all for like a 3% chance.
Precisely. And the risk of failure isn't just, disappointment, oh, well, didn't work. It's potentially catastrophic. Our modern practitioner, Katz, he describes the operation in really stark terms. He says it's at best the most intense divine working of one's spiritual life, or at worst a willed psychotic episode leading to a complete nervous breakdown. Think about it. You spend 6 months dismantling your ego, your whole worldview, through this intense ritualized pressure, and then if the angel doesn't appear, the resulting spiritual vacuum, the psychological emptiness, it could be irreparable. Failure could literally mean the end of your magical path. You've destroyed the old scaffolding of the self, but you haven't built the new foundation.
Okay, this is clearly a monumental undertaking, heavy stuff. Let's just quickly ground ourselves in the history. Where does this specific ritual actually come from?
Sure. It originates from a text called The Book of the Sacred Magic of Abramelin the Mage, as delivered by Abraham the Jew unto his son Lamech. Catchy title, huh? It's essentially a 15th century grimoire, a book of magic, specifically designed to trigger this objective mystical experience. The author, Abraham of Worms, claimed he received the system from a mysterious Egyptian mage named Abramelin.
Right, and the practitioner we're following, he used the famous Mather's translation. This seems kind of important, because didn't he know it was potentially flawed or incomplete?
Right.
Why would someone risk using a text they knew might have issues, especially when apparently better versions like Georg Din's were out there? That seems telling somehow.
What about
The mindset needed.
Yeah, it's fascinating, isn't it? It really speaks to the element of pure commitment, absolute trust in the process. He used the S.L. McGregor Mathers translation, which dates back to 1897. And yeah, it was based on an incomplete, kind of poorly put together French manuscript. Katz openly admits he knew about the later German translations by Georg Den, which were considered more comprehensive, more accurate. So why use the older, potentially flawed one? It seems to highlight a major theme of the whole operation. You have to rely on pure will, on faith, rather than just intellectual perfectionism or academic rigor. The idea is that the structure, the intention of the operation is so powerful, so profound, that even a slightly flawed map can get you there if your dedication is absolute. It meant he had to kind of put aside the scholarly concerns and just trust the process, the version that had been influential in the West for over a century.
Okay, that makes sense. Trust over perfection. So let's get into the nuts and bolts of the preparation. Our practitioner, Marcus Katz, or Frater FP, he undertook this 177-day operation back in 2004. And as we said, he wasn't a beginner. He had 30 years of esoteric background, witchcraft, Golden Dawn, Thelema, even chaos magic. That foundation seems absolutely mandatory.
Oh, completely. The source material is adamant about this. This is not a ritual for the casually curious or someone just starting out. The idea that you could somehow do this unprepared or find some kind of spiritual shortcut, Katz dismisses that entirely, calls it noise, not signal. Lord Abramelin himself laid out these very specific, kind of ideal physical requirements for the work. You're supposed to have a dedicated lodge, a terrace, an uncovered balcony, and crucially, a dedicated oratory, like a private chapel, for the main work of intense prayer. It really demands a separation from the everyday, profane world. Ideally, you'd be in a specially consecrated space.
And the ritual gear, the actual tools needed to sort of anchor this long, demanding process.
They're fairly simple, but symbolically very rich. You need a lamp, a censer for incense, and an altar in the oratory. That's the basic setup. Then the practitioner needs specific items. A white linen robe, symbolizing purity, a silk girdle or belt, a crown or circlet for the head, special oils, perfumes, and incense, which are used throughout, and a wand, ideally made of almond wood, which symbolizes spiritual awakening. The source, Katz's account, definitely notes the challenge of just acquiring these things, consecrating them properly, all while trying to maintain some semblance of a normal life on the side.
Right, and this is where things start getting interesting immediately, isn't it? Where the working itself seems to interact with the outside world, signaling that the gears are already turning through synchronicity. Tell us about the books he bought.
Yes. This anecdote is a perfect example of how the operation seems to exert its influence right from the get-go. So the practitioner decided he needed a new Bible, specifically for this working, kind of symbolizing the new covenant, the new relationship he was seeking. He went to a secondhand bookshop and felt really drawn to this particular Bible described as a bride's Bible, which felt hugely significant, symbolizing the marriage of the soul to its divine counterpart, the angel. Okay, so he buys that. Then right after, he picks up a book of Psalms, gets home, and as he's looking through the Psalms, a loose sheet of paper falls out. On it, there's a handwritten poem and some Latin text, and he immediately recognizes it. It's Psalm 22, "The Lord is my shepherd."
Wow.
Yeah, it's just appearing like that. The perfect guiding psalm for this kind of intense spiritual journey, seemingly out of nowhere, right from the tools he'd just gathered. For him, it was this clear sign the operation had already begun interacting with his reality, even before day one officially started.
That's pretty incredible. And speaking of preparation and mindset, that intensely devotional aspect, the hours and hours of prayer required, that sounds like it was a major hurdle for him. Given he didn't have a religious upbringing, how did he even approach learning how to pray sincerely?
Right, that was a big one. He realized pretty quickly he couldn't just go through the motions, couldn't just fake the devotion. He actually had to actively seek out instruction, learn how to be devotional from religious texts. He found particular guidance, interestingly, in Chaucer's Parson's Tale, which defined prayer not as just, mechanical repetition of words, but as a pious will of the heart that expresses itself through spoken word. The prayer in Abramelin has this dual purpose, asking for bad things to be removed and for good spiritual things to be attained. So this required a real shift in his perspective. He had to move away from the kind of control-based mindset you might find in other types of high magic towards one of utter surrender, humility, always putting his own will second to the will of God, or the HGA, that effort just to learn humility, to cultivate genuine faith. That was foundational to the whole thing.
Okay, let's break down the 177 days themselves then. The structure seems absolutely key here. It's divided into 3 distinct periods, right? Each lasting 2 moons and getting progressively harder. The first one, Phase 1, is called the Self-Extraction Program. That name alone. It sounds like some kind of intense psychological boot camp designed to just dismantle your old identity.
That's a pretty good way to put it, yeah. It is exactly that. Phase I sets up this incredibly rigorous daily routine. The whole point is to extract the practitioner, pull them out of the mundane momentum of everyday life. It kicks off with specific actions: bathing fully first thing, putting on fresh clothing, and then engaging in fervent oration prayer exactly 15 minutes before sunrise. And this isn't casual prayer. It's kneeling, facing an open window with a lamplit beside you. Then you repeat the whole thing precisely in the evening at sunset. Just that consistent, time-bound demand immediately sets the rhythm for this new, dedicated life. It disrupts your old patterns right away.
And the content of those prayers, the orations, it was focused on internal stuff: purification, opening the heart.
Absolutely. The exact words might have evolved for him over time, but the core intention remained constant. It was always about supplication to the divine will, offering thanks, confessing shortcomings, and the most important spiritual goal, he realized, was making sure the prayer actually connected with his heart, opened it up. It had to be felt, not just recited. Beyond the prayers, there was also a requirement for at least 2 hours set aside every single day for silent study, usually after dinner, just immersing the mind completely in the spiritual task at hand.
I'm also struck by some of the more subtle demands in Phase I. Things about maintaining ritual purity that seem almost logistical, but were clearly seen as vital for the atmosphere.
Yeah, those details point to the constant vigilance needed. The source highlights things like changing your bed sheets weekly and perfuming the sleeping chamber. Now, that might sound a bit obsessive, right? But Katz realized it wasn't arbitrary. It was necessary because the operation doesn't just stop when you finish your prayers. It continues intensely, even while you sleep. Your dreams, your subconscious thoughts, the sort of psychic residue of the day. All of that becomes part of the working and needs to be managed, kept pure. He came to see the working as totally consuming. He even wrote something like, "Aborting the ritual now would be incredibly dangerous to my state and condition." Every little detail mattered because the entire 6 months, your whole life, becomes the sacred space.
Okay, now here's where, for me, it gets really interesting, and maybe heroic in a modern sense. This collision between the sacred work and just ordinary life. Most traditional magical retirements, you're supposed to go off to a secluded cabin or something. But this practitioner, Marcus Katz, he was actually forced to integrate this incredibly high magic into contemporary society. He had to take what he called an abysmal employment.
Right. And this created this massive source of stress, constant testing, which, looking back, he believes was entirely intentional, part of the process itself. Apparently, he was financially stable enough not to need a job, but this opportunity just arose right as he was beginning the operation. It forced him back into the 9 to 5, the work-a-day world. And the job itself sounds dreadful. He described it as soulless, a horrible test on many levels. Involved a bullying boss, really trivial tasks, endless bureaucracy and friction. So his theory, is that accepting this awful job was actually part of the working. Designed by the angel, maybe, to test his commitment to the limit amidst the maximum possible external, profane distractions. Can you actually maintain focus and achieve K&C while dealing with a toxic office?
That's just an immense additional burden. So what were the specific psychological effects he noted?
Yeah.
His journal during this really stressful Phase I. We need to understand the human cost of trying to juggle these 2 worlds.
Oh, they showed up almost immediately, which kind of confirmed the work was already impacting his energy field, his psyche. On day 0, before it even officially started, and again on day 5, he experienced these intense, sudden headaches. Not like migraines, he said, but just sudden, crushing pressure. Then on day one, just being out in public in busy places, he described his skin tingling uncomfortably with the barrage of people's looped energies. His spiritual sensitivity was just skyrocketing, right when he was forced to endure maximum psychic noise from the outside world. But the worst point came on day 9. He recorded experiencing the most severe depression and despair he ever consciously felt in his life, described it as terrible and deathly horrible. This wasn't just feeling sad or down. It was this profound sense of hopelessness, almost like something was actively trying to convince him the whole path was pointless, that he should give up. You could say the ego was fighting back violently against its own impending dissolution.
And these effects inevitably spilled over into his family life too, right?
Mm.
Which must have just exponentially increased the stress levels.
Absolutely. The original Abramelin text actually warns about this. It says that social responsibilities, family ties, they will be tested thoroughly. And in his case, his wife, identified as B, started having these powerful, really disturbing nightmares, including specific ones involving violence, guard dogs, things that seemed to reflect the guarded, intense psychic state he was in. She felt, psychologically, like she was kind of locked into the garden-like area of his spiritual work, even though she wasn't formally participating. And she definitely noted his increasing dysfunctionality in just everyday terms. He had trouble focusing on domestic chores, sometimes seemed barely able to stay awake or make coherent conversation. There was this palpable sense of intense internal preoccupation that made him, difficult to live with. The pressure cooker is definitely on maximum heat, both internally and externally.
Okay, but despite this huge collision, the actual magical practice, the core work, it deepened. What specific techniques or insights did he discover with the prayers specifically that helped move the operation forward during that first phase, those first 55 days or so?
Yeah, this was a really crucial development for him. He moved beyond just reading the prescribed orations silently. He started actually speaking them aloud with force. And when he did that, he noticed his body spontaneously started rocking back and forth. His arms would raise up on their own. He later found historical illustrations confirming this was a known technique. This physical engagement resulted in a very distinct sensation during prayer, a feeling of rising or ascending. He realized the specific words of the prayer probably mattered less than the actual outflowing of the psyche, this kind of spiritual siphoning that starts happening on its own once the heart is truly engaged. The practice itself was becoming autocatalytic. It was driving itself forward.
In this intense physical and emotional strain, combined with the prayer, it successfully started doing what it was supposed to do. Dissolving the old self.
Yes, definitely. The self-identity, the ego structure, really began to become transparent, unglued from its usual anchors in the world. Around day 38, he described the emptiness that resulted from this dissolution, said it was almost unbearable at times. But right alongside that, he heard this clear external voice tell him, "When you die, nothing changes," which filled him, he said, with fear and hope in equal measures. He felt himself becoming unglued to the world at an alarming rate. Described the sensation of being like a person without history, without a past embedded in his personality, which felt, understandably, utterly weird, deeply destabilizing. But it was a sign the old self was successfully being destroyed.
And that voice, "When you die, nothing changes," suggests the angel, at least the connection to that higher self, was already actively communicating, even if just through these brief, externalized instructions.
It certainly seemed that way. He started receiving more of these distinct external-sounding voices, not just his own internal monologue, but something recognizably different, often accompanied by a physical sensation. They were usually quite specific, often comforting messages during difficult moments, like, "Be brave" on day 12, "Hold fast" on day 18. He said this voice had a recognizable tone, very brief, very direct, but also full of love and compassion. It felt like a sign of compassionate oversight, even amidst the really intense psychological grind he was enduring.
Okay, that takes us into the second phase then, phase 2, which the practitioner actually titled the slow funeral. That covers the second two-moon period. So if phase I was about self-extraction, pulling away from the mundane, phase 2 sounds like the full commitment to the death of that old self. How did the ritual demands ramp up here?
They intensified across the board, yeah. The prayers themselves grew significantly longer, deeper, required more emotional intensity. A new element was added. Ritual washing of the hands and face before every single oration to increase that sense of purity and preparation. And critically, weekly fasting began. Every Saturday, a complete fast. Plus, incense started being burned pretty much day and night in the oratory. The practitioner also consciously started seeking maximum retreat from the world. He recognized that the more external factors he had to deal with, like the job, the more complicated and taxing the whole experience became. So the funeral for the old life, the old self, was now fully underway. He was actively withdrawing.
And the psychological pressure during this funeral phase, it became purely existential, didn't it? Confirming that the process was working maybe too well.
Exactly. Around day 58, the sheer pressure of trying to maintain that dual existence magician in the oratory, employee in the office, it finally pushed his mind to a kind of breaking point. He described driving his car, and suddenly his mind became unpinned from the moorings. His sense of self completely detached from its history, its past experiences. He wrote in his journal, and this is quite striking, "I became a person without history in my personality and hence no future. Utterly weird." He had this profound realization that his self-identity, the Marcus he knew, was merely a carrier wave, nothing more, just a temporary structure. That's an alarming level of depersonalization for sure, but in the context of this work, it confirmed the ego was successfully disintegrating.
Wow. But alongside that frightening dissolution, there was a positive sign too. The presence of the angelic host, the beings of light, became much stronger, indicating he was perhaps passing the tests.
Much stronger, yes. Around day 60, he started feeling this undeniable presence of what he called the hosts of light during his orations. His head would physically fill with this intense golden light. Sometimes it was so strong it caused him to gasp, have involuntary physical reactions. He directly linked this experience to descriptions in other esoteric texts, like Crowley's Liber the Eighth, which talks about the chamber filling with light insufferable for splendor and a perfume intolerable for sweetness. This incoming spiritual energy started to feel like it was carrying him, lifting him on and upwards towards my goal, a holy escort, as he put it. It provided some much-needed spiritual relief against the constant psychological pressure and disintegration.
The source material also mentions a huge external breakthrough towards the end of Phase 2, related to his living situation. This seems really important, solving that conflict between the ideal ritual space Abramelin described and his current, somewhat chaotic home life.
Yes, this is a really powerful example of how the angel, once the connection strengthens, seems to begin actively reorganizing the practitioner's external reality to support the work. Apparently, his angel had directed him very simply, just told him, prepare to move. No details, just that. Soon after receiving that message, they found and were accepted for a rental property in Keswick in the Lake District, a place called the Forge Mill. And the timing was uncanny. They got the keys on the exact day his son finished his final high school exam. Just perfect timing for a move. And crucially, this new property included the exact kind of secluded attic room that Abramelin recommended for the final, most intense stage of the operation. It felt like the spiritual working itself was now actively orchestrating his external world, making it harmonize with the ultimate spiritual goal and removing that massive source of stress from his inadequate previous setup.
Okay, so the external environment is now aligned. The old self is nearly gone. We're entering Phase 3, the final 2 months. He called this one the empty door. This must have been the absolute peak of physical and spiritual exhaustion.
It sounds like it was the ultimate drain, yes. This is the most demanding phase by far. It continues that total withdrawal from the world. A third set of daily prayers was added at noon, which basically meant his days became a constant cycle of oration, prayer, and focus, interrupted only briefly by the absolute essentials of mundane life. Every ritual tool was meticulously prepared. Perfume and anointing oil were now used regularly to prepare both himself and the instruments, and incense was burned almost continually in the oratory. He noted that this final period stretched him beyond anything he had ever experienced before, felt constantly on the verge of physical collapse, just utter exhaustion, yet somehow spiritually held up, supported through it.
And what were the intense physical and energetic signs during this final push, this acceleration towards the KNC itself?
The visual phenomena, the energetic experiences, they became overwhelming. Almost undeniable proof that the angelic realms were physically present, or at least interacting very directly. On day 104, for instance, after a particularly deep emotional prayer session, he looked up and saw this soft, golden light had visibly settled above the altar in the room, just hanging there. On day 110, he had this profound experience of his own scale, feeling like he was somehow outside of his physical body as a much bigger self. He felt his large astral body being actively threaded up and patched and repaired by thousands of invisible agents. He perceived the hosts of light attending to him, preparing him. By day 154, just a couple of weeks before the end, he was describing the angelic realm's presence in the oratory as constantly visible. Flashes of light, pinwheels of color, bursts of radiance, phenomena so real, so undeniable that he said they caused him to just burst over with gladness and joy despite the exhaustion.
So he was fully prepared. Mentally, physically, energetically. The stage was set for the climax. And then the knowledge and conversation of the Holy Guardian Angel, day 169.
That's right. Day 169. At exactly 12:20 p.m., he writes, the K&C of the HGA was attained, precisely as described in the Book of Abramelin. That morning had been significant, too. He'd been directed presumably by the angel to paint 5 canvases, one representing the angel and the other 4 representing the 4 great princes of evil: Belial, Lucifer, Leviathan, and Satan. It was like a symbolic act of separating the light from the dark forces he was about to fully confront and command. After finishing his noon prayer session, he returned to the oratory, and that's when he saw the angel appear. It lasted for about 2 to 3 minutes, he estimated, gathering, manifesting in the thick incense smoke near the doorway.
Okay, the million-dollar question. What did it look like? What was the actual physical form or manifestation of this being that people dedicate their lives to contacting? How do you describe something like that?
Well, it definitely wasn't, a gentle figure with wings like you see in Renaissance paintings, or any standard religious image, really. He describes it as a vast, almost swimming manta ray shape of complex wings and light. The key thing he emphasizes is that its sheer, overwhelming presence was its physicality. There weren't separate things. He perceived it as a vast and mighty being, timeless, powerful beyond any human measure or category. Its presence was its form, and its form was its presence. And the immediate, overwhelming takeaway for him in that moment was simply everything in the Abramelin text was true. It was real.
And the conversation part of the knowledge and conversation, it sounds less like a polite chat, more like receiving divine marching orders.
Absolutely. That's a good way to put it. The communication was demanding. And initially, he says, pretty much one way. The angel wasn't asking his opinion. It immediately began providing very specific, sometimes quite unexpected instructions. Things about healing practices he should undertake, future travel plans he needed to make, and crucially, instructions for the final steps of the working itself. The reality of it was cemented later that same evening. He and his wife walked down to the nearby lake, Derwentwater, and they buried the ashes from all the incense burned during the operation near a National Trust memorial. It was a symbolic act, closing that preparatory phase, grounding this new, incredible reality he just accessed.
Which leads us straight into the final, apparently necessary, and frankly terrifying step. The Day of Demons, days 171 through 173. So you achieve this ultimate union with your highest divine self, the HGA. Why is the immediate next step to call up and bind the 4 top princes of evil? Lucifer, Leviathan, Belial, Satan. Shouldn't the angel just handle those guys?
It's a really good question, and it points to what makes the Abramelin Operation distinct from just pure mysticism. The K&C, the union with the angel, that's the mystical peak. But the binding of the demons, that's the magical culmination. It's the practical application of the authority you've just gained through that union. The idea is that the angel grants you the authority, the right, to command the entire hierarchy below it, including these immensely powerful forces. So the summoning and binding aren't just like an optional extra. They're necessary for the successful practitioner to establish the correct relationship with these powerful energies, to recognize them as subordinate aspects of reality, which are now placed firmly under the control of the unified, angel-informed will.
Okay, so it's not a postscript. It's the demonstration, proving the new integrated self actually has dominion now.
Exactly. It's the proof of concept, in a way. The invocation required summoning each of the 4 princes one by one and compelling them to obedience using the authority granted by the angel. Katz notes that what he might have expected may be a smooth, purely symbolic internal path working. That's not what happened. Instead, he described it as a more vociferous and moving event. It began with a distinct shadow falling over the oratory, a palpable presence manifesting behind him. The sources and his experience are clear. These are presented as real, distinct, powerful entities that have to be confronted directly and commanded forcefully.
And out of the 4 big ones, which one gave him the most trouble? Which is the hardest to actually bind into obedience?
Lucifer. Lucifer proved the most cunning, the most difficult to handle. Apparently, Lucifer attempted to turn my words around into entirely the opposite meaning, twisting the magician's own words of invocation back at him, trying to inject mockery, sow self-doubt, create chaos. The binding of Lucifer, he said, required immense sustained energy and focus, a real testament to the kind of power that has to be wielded at that stage. He also noted something interesting. The moment his concentration wavered or he dropped the magical call, the entities instantly vanished. which for him just confirmed their distinct objective presence. They weren't just in his head.
Right. And the ultimate reward, beyond establishing dominion for successfully binding this whole infernal hierarchy, the practitioner is granted specific personalized assistants,
Yeah.
familiars.
Yes, this is a fascinating aspect, sometimes overlooked but really profound. The successful operant is granted 4 personal familiar spirits, one for each of the 4 tides of the day. These aren't like pets. They're more like conduits for the newly attained authority, meant to assist in navigating the physical world and executing the operant's will. His account lists the ones granted to him. Palgoth, who was winged, assigned midnight to 6 a.m. Demina, appearing as a pleasing woman for 6 a.m. to noon. Shadrick, described as a hulking brute who removes physical obstacles for noon to 6 p.m., and Xenos, who is hooded and knows secrets, assigned 6 p.m. to midnight. So the idea is you now have this constant specific support team tailored to the different energies and challenges of the 24-hour cycle.
Okay, so the ritual is complete. Authority established. Angel contacted, demons bound, familiars granted. Done deal, right? But the source indicates the very next day, day 174, was actually called Black Tuesday. What happened when the entire scaffolding, the structure of the daily rituals that supported this whole colossal effort, was suddenly just removed?
Yeah, you'd think it would be pure bliss, right? But the removal of all those daily rituals, the constant praying, the fasting, the specific purity rules, it left what he described as an incredible vacuum, a profound divine silence. He felt suddenly vulnerable, almost destitute. He described it very starkly, saying it was like I've been kicked out of home and onto the street to earn my living. The feeling was that the old self was truly dead, but the connection to the angel, while real, was still like a newly growing presence. It wasn't yet fully integrated into his being. That initial overwhelming contact seemed to need the external ritual structure to sustain it. Once those supports were gone, the connection had to grow more naturally, more organically, almost like a new baby, over the subsequent months. He specifically mentions a 9-month period of integration.
That sudden spiritual stillness sounds incredibly jarring, maybe even disorienting. But it leads directly to the core philosophical shift, doesn't it? The big turnaround, the metanoia, that really defines the success of the whole operation.
It was a complete philosophical earthquake for him, yes. The world as he knew it, as we all generally perceive it, was fundamentally turned inside out. The core realization he came to was total uncompromising. The external world, the reality we all interact with, is actually our internal world, projected onto what he called a vastly complex interactive screen. He concluded, there are no people, places, time, or space, just the screen. And that all the objects, people, events we encounter, they're merely complex, responsive facets of our own consciousness playing out on that screen.
Whoa, okay, that's an immense concept to try and wrap your head around. If the external world is just an interactive projection of our internal state, what does that even mean for things like free will or identity, personal responsibility? Are we really interacting with other independent people or just complex reflections of ourselves?
That's precisely the kind of question this realization forces you to confront. And this is where the experience moves beyond just magic into total spiritual initiation. The post-Abramelin state, as he describes it, is one where the angel is now held as the absolute fundamental reality. He writes, it is we who become the fiction, the other, and the angel is held as the reality. The self, the ego, the personal history, the mundane personality you thought you were is realized to be merely a temporary function, a character playing out on that screen. And this realization apparently grants an immediate sense of total rest from all worldly concern. Why worry intensely about a job or a difficult person or a problem if they are ultimately just reflections of your own inner state projected onto the screen? The focus shifts entirely inward, to internal alignment with the angel, knowing or trusting that external reality will then conform to that internal alignment.
That new perspective would have to impact every single facet of life, wouldn't it? So let's look at the concrete results, the long-term consequences. He wrote about this 7 years after the operation. How did this massive transformation actually play out in his career, his life path?
The change was apparently absolute and pretty immediate. He left that lucrative IT management career, the very same abysmal employment that had tested him so much during the working, just walked away from it. He then went back to university, pursued a master's degree in Western esotericism, dedicated himself entirely to a new path, private therapeutic practice, using tools like NLP and hypnotherapy, and teaching the Western esoteric initiatory system publicly. He basically went from being, as he put it, a shaman in a suit, trying to hide his real interests, to being fully and publicly himself, teaching, writing, doing therapeutic work that was completely aligned with his inner reality, a total integration of his internal and external life.
And beyond the big life changes, he also confirmed the validity of those famous magical squares found in the Abramelin text, but with a really important caveat about how they work. Something about lust of result.
Yes, he emphasized that the squares, these coded talismans, they work with astounding precision, but only when used with complete detachment. Without that craving, that lust of result, which he says ruins all magic. He tells this brilliant, quite funny story about testing this shortly after the main operation finished. He decided to try a square, almost randomly, for a completely whimsical, frivolous desire, specifically to conjure 13 dancing girls on a Wednesday, just for the heck of it. He performed the small ritual associated with the square, then completely forgot about it, let go of the desire entirely.
Okay. And what happened the following Wednesday?
The following week, completely out of the blue, by sheer synchronicity, he got invited at the last minute to attend a Raqs Sharki class, that's Middle Eastern dance. He arrived, sat down on these Arabian cushions, there were live drummers playing, and there he was, watching exactly 13 women performing a belly dance routine on a Wednesday.
No way.
Yeah. The sheer, almost absurdly literal manifestation proved to him the squares worked, but crucially, only when the ego was detached, when the desire was just released into the angel system without attachment.
That synchronicity cranked up to 11. It almost suggests the angelic system executes instructions with this kind of humorless perfection, even for totally trivial requests.
It seems to confirm that the magical universe, post-K&C, becomes this responsive mechanism, just waiting for the authorized instruction from the operant. He gives another more practical example, too. He needed a name for his new tarot organization and wanted something unique, maybe derived from the squares. He was looking at one specific square symbasi, trying to find an anagram or a meaningful word, getting frustrated, about to give up. And the moment he let go of the striving, the lust of result, the word terosophy just popped into his head, fully formed. Later, he checked the description for that specific square, symbasi. Its purpose: to research and hear secrets from words. The squares acted as perfect vehicles, conduits for the divine result, functioning flawlessly once that K&C connection was established and the ego got out of the way.
Okay, so wrapping up our deep dive here, what's the final verdict from the practitioner on the angel's appearance in nature? Was this genuinely a physical, objective encounter in the end? Or could it still be interpreted as, say, an incredibly powerful internal vision, magnified by the intense process?
He seems quite firm on this. He confirms he physically saw and sensed the presence of the Ashamam first. These are described as fiery sparks of light, linked to the angelic realms manifesting even in Malkuth, the physical world. And then he perceived the physical presence of the holy guardian angel itself. He kind of notes that the experience itself makes objective assessment almost irrelevant. For the person having the experience, there's simply no denying its reality. It's self-validating. And the angel's nature, as we touched on, wasn't what he might have expected from, say, religious tradition. It was vast and mighty, timeless, incredibly powerful. That phrase, its presence was its physicality and vice versa, really sticks out. It indicates a being whose fundamental nature cannot be separated from its manifestation. He even compares the scale of it to the vast cosmic beings you might find in classic science fiction. It suggests something of profound, overwhelming scope that actually anchors reality itself.
So, this journey, from the intense mundane conflict of that abysmal employment all the way to total spiritual transformation over 177 absolutely grueling days, it really is perhaps the most honest, detailed modern account we have of this legendary ritual. The operation itself, with its incredibly strict rhythm of prayer, fasting, study, it really acted as a kind of mechanism, didn't it? Setting the tempo, providing the anchors for the real spiritual work, dissolving the ego, surrendering the self.
Exactly. And it emphasizes the sheer totalizing nature of the commitment required. The operation's true aim isn't just contact, it's the strategic destruction of the old self, forcing the soul into a state of surrender where the angel can then take over. This leads, apparently, to constant tutoring from the angel afterwards, ongoing insight into the unfolding patterns of reality. It's described as a complete evolutionary process that leaves the successful adept in absolutely no doubt about their new role, their new tasks in life. They've essentially received the operating manual for reality direct from the source.
A staggering conclusion, which leaves us, and maybe you listening, with a final thought to ponder. If, as this practitioner realized during that profound philosophical shift, the external world is merely your internal self projected onto a vastly complex interactive screen, and if we are personalities, our egos were actually the fiction, while the angel, that deeper self, is the ultimate reality, then what truths about your own identity might you be relying on that screen to hide from yourself right now? And what uncompromising, immediate, maybe even demanding instructions might you receive if you could somehow punch through that screen and discover your own true nature?